My guest today is Liberty McArtor, who holds a bachelor's degree in journalism from Patrick Henry College and previously worked in Washington, D.C. as a radio producer for WMAL's weekend talk show. She has also worked for the Liberty Institute in Plano, Texas, and is currently a staff writer for The Stream, writing at stream.org. Good morning, Liberty.
Good morning, Steve. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks so much for taking time to talk to us. So the topic is free speech, and now more than ever, I feel like I'm either writing or talking about free speech almost every single week, and campus speech in particular. And to that end, I recently shared a report from the Center for Academic Freedom that outlined student free speech protections for every state. When that report was issued earlier this year, no one in Wisconsin had really taken any extra steps to protect free speech on campus, but that's changing, isn't it?
It is. Earlier this month, the regents on the board for the University of Wisconsin did pass a free speech policy, and the goal is to teach students that they can listen to a speaker they disagree with, they can protest lawfully without getting disruptive and without getting violent. And so what the policy does is it outlines punishment for students who are disorderly or violent during another person's event, or interrupt somebody else's free speech. And they could actually be punished up to expulsion, and that's kind of why the policy has started a little bit of controversy.
When I was researching, I noticed that at another publication, somebody named Susan Nossel, who is an executive director at PEN America, which I guess is a national human rights freedom of expression organization, said that students don't understand the UW policy. They might think they don't have the right to protest. Now, you reported at stream.org that Kashana Cawley, writing in the New York Times op-ed, says the policy is unclear as to what constitutes violence or disorderly conduct. Now, is it just me, or does it sound like these folks are saying college students, and I'll add in people who oppose conservative speakers, are incapable of grasping the difference between protected public speech and violence and disorder?
Well, I think that for some college students, that definitely is the case, because when Ben Shapiro spoke at Berkeley last month, there was a lot of protesters there, saying speech is violence, and they actually had signs saying that. And then you also have college students arguing that it's okay to respond to violence with more violence. And so there you have kind of a situation where, okay, all of a sudden you have college students justifying violence on the basis of disagreement. So there is that aspect to it. I think some of the critics that are bringing a little bit more thoughtful critique to this policy, their main concern is that, it could be misconstrued by campus administrators what a student is doing. They could be lawfully protesting, but if they're protesting in a way administration doesn't like, then they'll just hit them up with a disorderly conduct ticket, so to speak. And that concern, is something that should be talked about. So I think it's a little bit of both, honestly.
So people who tend to like centralization of power and control are objecting to the centralization of power and control?
Right. I mean, this is really a funny situation because on the one hand, I think it's been conservatives mostly recently that have been saying, hey, we have to defend free speech here. We can't get into violent brawls every time somebody has a controversial idea. So they come forward with the policy to protect that. And all of a sudden now it's the left saying, hey, you're threatening our free speech. And what if students protest and they get unfairly punished for exercising the First Amendment? And something that I included in the article, Clarence Page, a columnist for the Chicago Tribune, just says, it's disturbing how partisan the issue of free speech has become. And instead of just protecting free speech for all, it has become, I think, a very partisan issue. And people aren't really able to see clearly. And I think a lot of it is, too, these college students, they were not raised to handle ideas that they disagree with or to handle other worldviews. And so, a policy can help, but to what extent can it actually correct that educational damage that they grew up with?
That's true. Now, you write that Tony Evers, Wisconsin Democratic gubernatorial candidate and the only region on the board of the University of Wisconsin to vote against the policy, calls the UW policy an effort to cozy up to Wisconsin Republicans. What does he mean by that?
Well, first, it's worth noting, I can't remember if you just mentioned it just now, but Evers, he is running for governor there in Wisconsin. He's a Democratic candidate. So he probably, this is a little bit of a political move to come out against the policy. But the Wisconsin Assembly did pass a bill recently that is basically just mirroring this policy, or the policy mirrors the bill. The bill hasn't gone through the Senate yet. It hasn't become law. but it was a bill basically saying the same thing, that at the University of Wisconsin, across the state, students cannot disrupt somebody else's free speech with disorderly conduct or violence, and then they'll get punished. And so even though it hasn't become law yet, the University of Wisconsin just kind of adopted the language in that bill and applied it to their policy.
I wasn't actually able to find the UW policy, but I was able to find the legislation, LRB 2408. Now, I don't see anybody talking about this, but when I look at this, I see all sorts of very straightforward due process protections for anybody who is accused, but nobody's really talking about that.
Right, and I haven't seen the policy either, but it from everything that I have read, it does very closely mirror the language of the bill. And whenever they say what constitutes disorderly conduct, what if students get accused falsely, the bill lays out, violent, abusive, indecent, profane, boisterous, obscene, unreasonably loud, or disorderly conduct. That's how they define that. So I think supporters of the policy will say, hey, look, it seems pretty clear, but the critics are still going to say that expulsion or suspension is a very harsh punishment, and that you just have to say, well, how much do we value free speech, and how are we going to enforce this if the consequences aren't serious?
Well, I think they definitely have a right to be afraid that it'll be abused, because human nature tells us that that's certainly going to be the case. And your opinion, do you think this policy is going to be a boon for conservative speakers and students in general, or do you think it's going to be a chaotic mess?
Well, it's hard to say. I really get both the critics and the goal behind the policy. Again, I think it comes down to the way that kids are raised and the way that they're taught how to respect other people, even if they disagree with them. And so, policies that help protect speakers, I think are a good idea. But on the other hand, most colleges already have policies in place against violence or against breaking the law. So maybe if we just enforced those a little bit more and focused on raising children, as young as in, elementary school, to handle different ideas without getting upset, get rid of this idea of a safe space, then we wouldn't need policies like this. So to me, it goes deeper than just a simple campus policy.
The Center for Academic Freedom report that I mentioned earlier, if you go through it, most of the states defer the protections to the state and federal constitution. I think there's only about 14 states that have passed anything more specific, and those usually have to do with speech zones or protection for religious groups, their rights to choose their own members and their leadership, that sort of thing. So I can see why they might think that they need to impose an additional layer. But, as a constitutional conservative, I'm like, it's right there in the Constitution. It just says, you just got to read it. What's the big deal?
Right.
Why do you have to do all this extra work?
Right, and I think that just shows, kind of what's wrong with our culture is that all of a sudden the Constitution isn't enough, and we're adding on layers and layers and layers of policy or law to say something that we've already said. And so if we're not already enforcing the laws that are there, are we going to correctly enforce an extra policy or an extra law? So, I understand sometimes, things might need to be clarified for a new generation that doesn't understand it, but again, I think this just comes down to really teaching young people to respect the Constitution and understand what free speech is, understand what violence is. Speech is not violent. Hearing an opinion that you don't like or that offends you is not violence. And for some reason, I guess the education system and culture has failed this generation of Americans, and because, that's what they think.
It strikes me as odd because progressives control, I don't know what, art, music, television, movies, print, TV news, advertising, the internet, kind of, They have a pretty good stranglehold on public education, a lot of private higher education. They have a monopoly, really. I mean, you can't even discuss the weather without it being political. And still, the idea of sitting and letting someone you disagree with speak to a room full of students for 30 minutes or an hour without interruption violates someone's rights. I think that you're right, the culture, but I mean, this culture is a product of the university and the education system. The very people who are complaining about us trying to institute regulations to protect speech are kind of responsible, aren't they, for the fact that we need it in the first place?
Yeah, I definitely think so, because, traditionally, colleges and universities have been a place where students can interact with ideas and really dig into different philosophies and worldviews and figure out where they stand. And we don't see that anymore. We see the coddling of students. We see, and I don't remember the exact percentage, but an overwhelming majority of college faculty in America today is left-leaning and liberal. And I think, you're even starting to see some liberal and Democratic, faculty members across the nation speak up and say, this is a problem, because we do understand that if you just have one opinion, one worldview that is consistently drummed into young person's minds, then they're not going to develop those critical thinking skills to deal with other ideas. And I've seen, comments on this issue from other students who say, I support the policy because I want to be able to go to a speech and actually engage with the speaker, even if I don't agree, because I want my turn to be able to stand up and ask a challenging question or kind of engage in that civil debate. But the students who are, protesting and yelling and shouting them down and starting violence, it interrupts that for everybody. So it definitely is, I think, a big part of it is the campus problem as well. Just, there's so much bias there.
You work with First Liberty Institute. Their primary mission is to literally use the legal system to protect religious liberty. Do you suspect, and I always suspect this whenever there's a law or somebody with a lawyer nearby, that adding another layer of protection, with scare quotes, won't progressives just arm themselves up with lawyers and look for lawsuits to challenge this bill and then complain about how much it's costing taxpayers?
That's definitely a possibility. And one thing about going to the courts is that is really effective in setting a good precedent that can be helpful for the future. But there are already, a lot of court cases out there from the past that have defended students' right to not just religious freedom, but free speech and, free protest in the school system, in the public school system, all the way from elementary school to universities. So I think that if this did go to the courts, it would be hard to say whether or not how this policy would hold up and how that would work out. But I could definitely see it going to the courts. But I think, again, we're kind of coming back to that. The Constitution already protects free speech. Supreme Court cases in the past already protect free speech. So maybe this policy is an opportunity for the right and the left to get together and say, okay, we're concerned about free speech on campus, and so we enact this policy. Now you're concerned about free speech on campus. Let's figure out how to protect it for everyone.
That would be great. Do you have any other closing thoughts on speech, campus speech, or conservatives on college campuses?
Well, I would just say, again, I think it really comes down to enforcing the laws that are already there and just encouraging students that they can actually be more effective and strengthen their own position, no matter what it is, if they engage with people of a different idea. And I don't think students are told that often enough. I was a college student recently, and I just, from seeing that, I think students really need to be told that if you engage with someone and you listen to someone and learn about their views, even if it's very different than yours, it will strengthen your own position, and then the whole society will be better off. So that would be my encouragement to students or other people who know college students. Tell them that.
Okay, well, you can read this article and more from Liberty McArtor at stream.org. Liberty, thanks so much for making time to speak with me today.
Thanks, Steve.
All right, you have a great day.